It was past midnight on a stormy night. The rain had been falling for hours, heavy enough that most people would have stayed home. But James, a 32-year-old delivery driver, had one last trip to make before heading back. The road he took was a lonely stretch of highway, lined with tall trees that bent and swayed with the strong wind. The wipers on his car squeaked back and forth, barely keeping up with the downpour. Visibility was poor. The road was slick. Every time lightning lit up the sky, the empty fields on either side of the road appeared for a brief second, then vanished again into darkness. He was tired. The only sound inside the car was the steady rhythm of rain hitting the roof and the hum of the engine. He thought about how quiet the world felt in moments like this. No other cars on the road. No voices. Just the storm. And then, he saw her. A figure on the side of the road. A young woman, standing completely soaked, her long hair sticking to her face, her clothes plastered to her skin. She didn't have an umbrella, didn't even try to shield herself from the storm. She just stood there, one arm out, signaling for a ride. For a split second, James thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night, in weather like this? He slowed his car, his headlights cutting through the rain, and the figure became clearer. She was young, maybe in her late teens or early 20s. She looked cold. Shivering. Her clothes clung to her like she had been walking in the rain for hours. James hesitated. He had heard stories of people being robbed by hitchhikers, or of strangers causing trouble. But looking at her, he couldn't bring himself to drive past. Something about the way she stood there in the rain, helpless, made him feel he had no choice but to stop. James rolled down his window slightly, the rain spraying in through the gap. "Do you need a ride?" he shouted over the storm. The girl only nodded. She didn't speak. He unlocked the passenger door, and she climbed in without a word. The air inside the car filled instantly with the scent of wet clothes. She sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on the windshield. Water dripped from her hair onto the seat. James tried to start a conversation, asking where she was heading, if she was okay, but she didn't answer right away. Finally, in a soft voice, she whispered an address. It wasn't far, just a few miles down the road, in an older neighborhood he didn't recognize well. He nodded and kept driving. For the next several minutes, the car was silent, except for the rain and the occasional roll of thunder. James glanced at her from time to time. She didn't look at him. She just stared straight ahead, her pale face expressionless, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though she were freezing. As they got closer to the area she mentioned, James looked into his rearview mirror, and his heart skipped a beat. The seat beside him was empty. The girl was gone. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the wet road. He pulled over and turned on the interior light, looking around frantically. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard it click. The seat belt was still fastened across the empty passenger seat. But she was gone. Confused and shaken, James drove the rest of the way to the address she had given. It was a small, worn-down house at the end of a narrow street. The lights were on inside. He got out of his car, the rain soaking him instantly, and ran up to the porch. An elderly couple answered the door. James explained what had just happened, that he had picked up a young woman, soaked in the rain, and that she had given him this address before disappearing from his car. The couple listened quietly. Then, with tired eyes, the old woman shook her head. "You must be mistaken," she said softly. "Our daughter, she died 15 years ago. Right on this road. She was hit by a car during a storm. A rainy night, just like tonight." James stood frozen on the porch, the rain dripping from his hair, soaking through his jacket. He didn't know what to say. But then he remembered. His eyes widened. He turned slowly back toward his car. On the back seat was a jacket. A wet, heavy jacket. The one the girl had been wearing when she climbed into his car. It was real. He had felt the weight of it when she sat down. And now it sat there, as if she had left it behind. James never forgot that night. Some nights, when storms are strong enough to rattle his windows, he swears he can smell the faint scent of rain-soaked fabric inside his home, as though she has come back, still looking for a ride. To this day, no one can explain how the jacket ended up in his car. But everyone who lives near that stretch of road agrees on one thing: on stormy nights, you don't drive alone. Because she is still out there, waiting. Would you have stopped for her on that stormy night? For many people, a storm means shelter. It means closing the windows, locking the doors, and waiting for the weather to pass. But for David, a 41-year-old man living in a quiet neighborhood outside of town, one particular storm would uncover something far more disturbing than wind and rain. It was late on a Friday night. The sky had been pouring for hours. The roof of his small home was old, patched together after years of small repairs. As the rain hammered down, he noticed the occasional drip of water hitting the floor in his hallway. He placed a bucket beneath the leak and returned to the couch. Nothing unusual. Old houses creak during storms, and the sound of water dripping into a bucket was easy enough to ignore. But not everything he heard that night could be explained away. At first, it was faint. A soft shifting sound from above the ceiling. Like someone dragging something heavy across the attic floor. David told himself it was the storm. Old houses make noise. Wood contracts. Beams shift. And besides, what else could it be? But as the night went on, the sound returned. Louder. More deliberate. It wasn't the random creak of wood. It was movement. Steady, slow, almost cautious. He muted the television and listened. The rain outside filled the silence, but beneath it, he could still hear it, a shuffle, then stillness. A thump. Then silence again. He held his breath. The sound came once more, above him, directly overhead. David tried to reason with himself. Maybe it was rats. Maybe water dripping onto stored boxes, shifting them around. He grabbed a broom and tapped the ceiling a few times. The sound stopped. For the moment, it seemed solved. He sat back down, but the unease lingered. When you live alone, every noise feels magnified, especially during a storm. Minutes later, he walked into the kitchen. That's when he noticed something odd. A loaf of bread on the counter had been torn open. Not sliced. Torn. He hadn't done that. A few crumbs scattered on the floor led toward the hallway. He frowned, trying to remember if he had left it out. He hadn't. He was sure of it. Still, he cleaned up the mess, blaming it on mice, and convinced himself to go to bed. But before heading upstairs, his eyes caught something else, the attic ladder. It was slightly lowered. Not much, just an inch or two, as though it hadn't been pushed back all the way. David froze. He was certain he hadn't been up there in weeks. His stomach tightened. He climbed the stairs slowly, his heart pounding louder than the storm outside. Standing beneath the ladder, he could feel the faintest draft of cool air coming down. He stared at it for a long time, the hair on his arms rising. Something wasn't right. The next day, the storm continued. David checked his pantry and fridge. Several items were missing. A pack of biscuits, gone. A carton of milk half empty. He lived alone. No visitors. No one else had access to his home. The unease from the night before returned, heavier this time. He decided to look into the attic. Armed with a flashlight, he pushed the ladder down fully and climbed up. The smell hit him first. Damp. Stale. Mixed with something else he couldn't quite place. He scanned the beam of light across the attic. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Boxes, old furniture, insulation scattered in the corners. But then he noticed a small blanket laid out on the floor. Next to it, empty food wrappers. Crumbs. Even a half-filled bottle of water. His chest tightened. Someone had been up here. Living. Eating. Sleeping. While he had been right below, unaware. Panic surged through him. He climbed back down quickly, locked the ladder, and called the police. They told him to stay calm, that an officer would arrive soon. But the storm slowed their response. David sat in the living room, his flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, every muscle tense. Minutes felt like hours. Then, it happened. A flash of lightning lit up the house for a split second. In that brief burst of light, David saw it. At the top of the attic ladder, a face. Thin. Gaunt. Eyes staring directly down at him. His breath caught in his throat. The face disappeared as the room went dark again. He stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, scrambling toward the front door. He could hear movement above, the shuffle of limbs, the scrape of wood. He burst outside into the rain, refusing to re-enter until the police arrived. When they finally did, the officers went into the attic. What they found was worse than David expected. In the far corner, behind stacked boxes, was a makeshift bed. Clothes, rags, wrappers, and a small notebook. The intruder had been living there for weeks, perhaps months. But the most chilling discovery was inside that notebook. Page after page of writings. Observations. Notes about David's daily life. The times he left for work. The shows he watched. What he ate for dinner. Even the moments he slept on the couch. And one line repeated across several pages, "He doesn't know I'm here." The man was arrested that night. Thin, dirty, and barely able to speak, he was dragged out of the attic into the pouring rain. But for David, the damage was done. The knowledge that someone had been above him, silently watching, was something he could never shake. For weeks, he slept in a hotel, unable to be in his home. He had thought the noises were just the storm. He had told himself the food missing was just his imagination. But storms don't lower attic ladders. Storms don't leave behind journals. And storms don't watch you while you sleep. How long do you think someone could live above you before you noticed? A ringing phone can be comforting. It can mean family calling to check in, a friend reaching out, or an important message that can't wait. But there are also calls that come when they shouldn't, calls that seem to slip past the barriers of time and reason, leaving behind more fear than answers. What you're about to hear is one of those calls. It happened on a storm-soaked night. The kind of night where the wind howls through the trees, making them scrape against the windows like fingers. Thunder rolled so deeply it rattled picture frames on the wall. The house stood in darkness after the power cut out, leaving only the faint glow of lightning flashing in the distance. Inside, a teenager sat alone, trying to push past the unease of being trapped in silence. No television. No lights. Just the storm outside, and her own thoughts keeping her company. Then, breaking through the roar of thunder, came a sound she wasn't expecting. The landline phone rang. It startled her. In a world filled with mobile phones, the landline barely rang anymore. When it did, it was usually her father's old friends, or maybe a neighbor in need. She thought for a moment about letting it go unanswered. But the sound kept cutting through the storm. Reluctantly, she lifted the receiver and pressed it to her ear. At first, there was silence. Just the faint hiss of static. She was about to hang up when a voice broke through. It was low, almost a whisper. And it spoke only one word, her name. Not once, but twice. Slowly. As if the caller wanted her to know they weren't mistaken. She froze, her hand tightening around the phone. She didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't a classmate, or a relative. It was colder than that. Unfamiliar, yet deliberate.